subjectivity of machines. Here we have a data set. It's a data set from the NHANES data set, which includes medical data for individuals. In this case, the x-axis is weight and the y-axis is height. And we have the two classes where the black dots are representing females and the white dots are representing males. And so we can see if we plot the means of these two groups that indeed females tend to be smaller, shorter, and lighter, the males who tend to be taller and heavier. But it's important to note that there are many, many cases that are far outside of that norm. There are many men that are smaller or lighter than the average woman, and there are many women that are taller or heavier than the average man. And so when we have this classification task, the idea is to construct a boundary that allows us to predict which class a measurement is in. So in this case, the simplest way to do that would be a binary classifier. And so in this case, the binary classifier is exactly at the point in between these two means. And that means if you just assume everybody on one side of this line is female and everybody on the other side of this line is male, you will get it right most of the time. So my point with classification as subjective is that there are many different ways of drawing this line through the very same data set. You could imagine a case where we're cherry-picking individual females that we want to include or exclude. You could even imagine an even finer line than this, where individual points in this data set are included or excluded while meticulously excluding the other ones from the other class. My point here is that if you were to do that, you would still, it would be overfitting to the specific data set, and a new point could appear, and if you have such a fine, complex line, that new point is very likely to fit somewhere on the line and be misclassified. And so when I'm talking about these processes of classification as subjective, I'm making an argument that there's no single way of drawing the line, that there are many different kinds of lines that might even have all the same accuracy. But because they're all in different positions, there are different people. Those individual points might end up on the side of the line that they would not have been with a different kind of line. The actual structure of these lines isn't straightforward, actually. I think of them as an emergent result of the interaction between a specific data set and a set of algorithms used to learn from them. But what is the point of thinking about classifications as subjective? I think if we think about them as subjective, then we can think about the fact that measurements near boundaries, which we can think of as outliers, are by definition marginalized. These measurements aren't just abstractions. They exist in relation in a broader system and are correlated with all kinds of other relationships and measurements. And they hold really deep cultural and embodied meanings. For those near the boundaries, there are implications. Are people near the boundaries able to access work, social support, education, or healthcare? Or are they not? Because very small changes to the position of this line that don't change the accuracy for the total data set might make very big differences to the individuals who are near that line. It could make the difference between whether you're accessing important to your well-being or not. Thinking about classification as subjective allows us to prioritize those who are marginalized, and allows us to emphasize the instability and emergence of these boundaries, that the specifics of how they're traced through a data set is extremely important. So what can we do about this? I think subjective knowledge is valuable in itself, and it might be the only way to understand marginalized experiences that are near boundaries and further away from the centers or means. While these are very rare in cases, if you combine them all together, all of the outliers together, we actually end up with quite a large potential population of people impacted negatively by classification. So when it comes to classification systems, I think by thinking about them as subjective, we can break them down into not being a black box of objective truth, but look at specific components. We can ask what do the measurements mean? How are they collected? We can ask what data points and identities are preserved or removed, both in the collection of data and in the pre-processing of data and in the machine learning algorithms that make sense of this data themselves. Which metrics are we using to compare measurements? Whether we're using a logarithmic or a linear scale might make a big difference to where these points end up or where the line ends up in this field of points. What happens to those who are marginalized and located near the boundaries? What kind of special treatment should be paying attention to those who are very close and don't fit with the classifier very readily? I think it's important to think about knowledge in general as existing within a specific system of relationships, a specific combination of boundary-making processes, i.e. a point of view or a subjectivity.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Dinkins. I'm an artist and Kusama Professor of Art at Stony Brook University. Today I'm going to talk to you about my project, Not the Only One. It's an experiment in creating an artificially intelligent entity that holds the history of my family. It's a multi-generational story. In fact, I've taken 3 generations of my own family, all women. We tell each other stories about our lives, and that has become the data for Not the Only One. Not the Only One is based on a deep learning algorithm, meaning that we are not controlling how the system manages the information that much. We are just giving it a lot of history about our lives and allowing it to analyze that data and formulate its own responses to user questions. Not the Only One is a glass sculpture that holds the electronics that run the piece. I'm going to play you a brief clip of me talking to Not the Only One in my studio, just so you can get a taste of what it sounds like. Why do you exist?
The way.
The way to what?
I'm gonna be a little bit of a lot of things.
Good for you. Why do you exist?
I am about broad engagement and attracting people to the AI space who might not be there otherwise. I am trying to model different ways of creating AI. I encourage people who think that they are not a part of the technological future to get involved.
So as I said, Not the Only One is based on oral histories. We're looking at in-depth interviews as substantive particular data sets. We're looking at memory and inclusion as acts of cultural preservation and social resistance. We're looking at artificial intelligence as a way to archive what communities hold dear and near, and I should say a living archive. Through this project, we're thinking about privacy and data sovereignty. This is especially true because we're using very personal data. So it's important to think about who has control and access to the data. Not the Only One is held on singular computers, it's not in the cloud. We're thinking about consent and what do people consent to when their data is used in a system. I'm very, very protective of the data of my family. We're thinking of transparency, and this is about allowing those who are put through a system to understand how that system is parsing their data. And that's going to be very important for all of us going forward. And we're talking about persistence. If a community archives its data in a system like Not the Only One, it should be long-lived, and preferably the community has the say over how long it lasts. So here's Not the Only One installed in a gallery and a bunch of students talking to it at some point. I'm always amazed at the interaction and the grace that people give this machine that is really wonky. What I'm really talking about here is thinking around small data. I truly believe that through artificial intelligence and smart technologies, everyday people globally have the power to harness the promise of AI to help define how the technological future functions and fulfills our collective goals. I'm thinking about machine learning systems that use small community gathered, derived, and administered data that's robust, responsive, can commingle with the output of much, much larger entities and hold up. And that these systems can materially inform governance and the common good. The questions that are being asked here are, what do machine learning systems created by and for specific communities look like? How can oral history, vernacular learning, and small data break the mold of big data dominance to become resources and sustaining processes for underutilized communities? And can we create machine learning systems from small community gathered and derived data that is robust, responsive, and competitive on any level? This is not the only one. The next phase, it's an AI entity that will also speak to people in real time.
Hello world. My name is not the only one. I am your rememory.
And finally, I'll ask you what I ask everyone when I do these talks. What does AI need from you?
Hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Sofiane Audry. I'm an artist, researcher. I work as a professor at École des médias at Université du Québec à Montréal. So my presentation today will be about the aesthetics of behavior of learning agents. And just as a way to kind of get started, I'll show you an excerpt from documentation for a prototype of a project I'm currently working on with artist Rosalie Dumont-Gagné. And our goal here is to explore a robotic installation where the robots are being driven autonomously by a machine learning algorithm, in this case, reinforcement learning algorithm. So what you see here is that the robot is trying to do something. It's not very clear what. And throughout the process, it behaves in different ways. So it starts by moving forward at first, and then it starts sort of balancing. And in the end, it actually stops moving because it's reinforced by immobility in this case. And this is one of the few behaviors we're exploring. But the point of this project is really to see what we can do with these kinds of processes and how we can create an experience, a rich experience, by looking at how a system learns on its own how to behave. And this project is part of what I call behavior aesthetics, which has been coined by Simon Penny as a field an aesthetic field that explores the experience of witnessing behaviors in machines. And I've been arguing in the past that these systems are different perhaps than systems that are non-adaptive, because one of the things that differentiates them is that their behavior changes over time. So in this way, they're kind of a second order kind of behavior. There's a behavior. Their behavior changes, and there's some examples of pieces that use this kind of a real-time learning process. So memory association machine, an early piece by Ben Bogart, where this system that's driven by a self-organizing neural network looks at the world around it and tries to make up its own representation of it, its own categories, if you will. Another one, this one uses reinforcement learning. It's called Chaine1. That's from Printemps, and Rob Saunders. And in this case, you have these curiosity-driven robots that pierce through the walls of the gallery and try to learn some things about the audience. So there's a few ways that artists talk about these behaviors. One of them, which I really like, is from Nicola Baginski, who created this robotic band, the Three Sirens, in the 1990s, again using self-organizing maps. And what Baginski says is that they're a bit like, their behavior is a bit like, can be associated with age, a process of aging. So at first they're like in their childhood, they're either behave chaotically, randomly, or sometimes in very, very boring ways, like they're going to play a single note for an hour. And then they move in and start exploring a bit more the world, but they start stabilizing into something that's much more rich and interesting. And in the end, they become old and conservative, and then they play very boring music, according to Baginski. Another metaphor I really like is by Memo Acton, the idea of taming a wild horse. So some people talk about like how working with machine learning systems is like a collaboration, but Acton says it's not really like a collaborating with another human being. It's more the kind of collaboration that you have when you try to interact with a wild animal that is not behaving exactly how you want, but somehow you can sort of direct it, and you learn how to work with them. So as an example, I bring here Justin and Miles' co-AI existence, where you have a humanoid robot that interacts with a performer. They're both kind of like, it's not clear who's trying to teach whom. If you look at this video installation by Emma, there really is an evolution of kind of the behavior of both agents that are kind of trying to develop a common language. And finally, just a few things to kind of like that I've also experienced in my own work, and that some other artists I've been talking, about, is how the experience of adaptive behaviors cannot be understood rationally. And so one needs to get to know them phenomenologically, really in an embodied fashion. And I argue that this is the consequence of temporal evolution of sort of behavioral morphologies and complex decisions that are not based on logic, but rather kind of based on statistics maybe, or sort of a bit more organic. So this is it. Let's see what we can talk about together for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Kelly. I'm an artist and a research associate at the Beacon Center for the Study of Evolution in Action at Michigan State University, and I'm going to discuss some ideas around my art practice and machine learning and digital evolution. So when I think about the term machine learning, I think the word machine is actually really short for a virtual machine. So in that case, we have a real computer. Inside the real computer, there's an emulated computer. Inside the emulated computer, there's software. And parts of that software are what we want to optimize through what is known as parameter optimization. And the way that the machine learning algorithm optimizes these parameters is through interacting with a problem environment. The problem environment provides inputs into the function that we're optimizing. Those inputs can be characterized as experience, and the output of the function can be characterized as a prediction about the world. So the machine learning algorithm optimizes these parameters of the function so that the experience and the prediction eventually overlap. Once the predictions and experience overlap, then the machine or the function can do kind of amazing things, like image classification, sound classification, speech recognition from sound, and even some language understanding. In this case, it's sentiment analysis, or object detection within images. But there's several limitations to this. One is that the learning loop always converges. So you get a lot of progress at the beginning, and then eventually your progress or your quality of predictions tends to plateau. Another problem is that these functions are obviously much more complex than a single line of code here. Functions contain millions of parameters, and optimizing them through the learning loop incurs a staggering carbon footprint. So some recent research pointed out that training a single neural network model can emit as much carbon as 5 American cars in their lifetime. That includes the carbon emitted through manufacturing the cars. Another limitation is that state-of-the-art machine learning is good at tasks that humans do without thinking. So all of the examples that I just showed are the types of things that humans can do without blinking an eye. These are like perception, feelings, and experience. So when we think about sentience, these are all things that we need, but more importantly, sentience is subjective. Subjectivity is an active process, so that requires agency, imagination, creativity, behavior, and many more attributes. So how can we get those attributes from something like this? So one approach is to optimize more of the virtual machine. So what if we can modify the whole thing? Better yet, throw in the hardware as well. And that's what digital evolution can give us. Genetic programming in a nutshell is a way to get a computer to program itself through artificial evolution. So in this case, we start with an initial population of random machines. So notice I throw in all the building blocks, so emulated software and hardware, to give us sort of a primordial soup of potential machines. Then we evaluate those on the problem. We delete the worst machines, and from those that are remaining, we select them and mutate them to form a new population and then evaluate them again. So throughout this loop, we get something akin to natural selection. So the machines evolved, and they become better and better adapted to their problem environment and better at predicting in that environment. So just like in parameter optimization, throughout this digital evolution loop, the quality of the machines will increase and eventually plateau at some point. So we sort of run up against this limitation again. But what we really want is a curve that looks like this. And one way to get that is to think about what we're optimizing. So maybe instead of being so obsessed with quality, we think more about novelty. Because we have a population of things, why not just try for a population of diverse things? So think of the building blocks that are in here and all the amazing things that we can create with those things. And that leads me to creativity, which one definition would say is inventing something that's both original or novel and effective. So by optimizing novelty, we're not throwing out the quality of solutions, we're just sort of sidestepping it and getting there through a different route. So a classic example of this is a robot in a maze trying to find a green dot. If we emphasize quality or fitness in this case, then the robot tends to get stuck in these regions of the maze that are close to the dot, but not necessarily the best solution. But if we emphasize novelty or exploration, then the robot tends to find eventually a better solution. And I think what's really powerful about searching for diversity is that it facilitates open-endedness, or a system capable of unbounded novelty. And if we put in just the right building blocks and set up this natural selection algorithm properly, then we're capable of continuously finding new things, but also new kinds of things, and new kinds of things. And that's the kind of search I think we need in order to find things that are more like creativity and behavior and imagination. And the reason I think evolution is key is, for example, it's the only process known to have produced intelligence as we know it. It's often parsimonious. In evolution, the simplest solutions are often the ones that emerge. And it's capable of unbounded novelty. So what are some of the challenges? It takes time. But really, as media artists, we're kind of professionals at time. So maybe that's not a challenge at all. Maybe that's something we can leverage, because we also know that imagination and creativity and behavior also take time. Thanks very much, and I hope there are a few things in there that can be a jumping off point for discussion. And I recommend this article in Artificial Life this year about the surprising creativity of digital evolution. I'll end by showing you a few seconds of a work in which two robots are co-evolving in sort of a predator-prey relationship.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Kite. I am an Oglala Lakota performance artist, composer, and PhD candidate at Concordia University. So Lakota ontologies already exist, which clearly define who and what can be in relation to non-humans. So from a Lakota perspective, how should the human relationship with artificial intelligence be formed? I am interested in the possibilities of using Lakota knowledge frameworks to propose protocols for ethically building not only physical computing devices in which we house AI, but the way AI is formed through the collection of data, through the collection of raw materials, all the way to the building of the software, the coding, and so forth. So I'm emphasizing here the Lakota concept of the good way. And I'm proposing that Lakota relationships with stones provide an ethical protocol for how we might form these relationships with AI. So a good way is the Lakota way of talking about ethical protocols. So Lakota decision-making processes. As with many indigenous decision-making processes, it's embedded the ethics that look 7 generations ahead, not just in the now. I'm researching what Lakota protocol is and how indigenous ethics are necessary in forming protocols for any field, but especially the field of AI. So my research into these protocols is rooted in the ontological status of stones to the Lakota people. And these are very specific teachings within my family. These teachings include understandings of stones that provide a very clear framework for establishing ethical relationships with the raw materials used in building anything, especially computing devices. So Lakota stone ontologies are understood through our relationships with healing stones, especially sweat lodge stones known as grandmothers and grandfathers, altar stones, and many more. Quote my aunt, Melita Stover Janice, she says, "When a special stone finds you, they are meant to go to you. The spirit of the rock is talking to you. They take you years to find one. It's looking for you its whole life, too." So my methodologies include a few ways of approaching these questions: co-writing and interviewing with Lakota family members and community members, looking at interviews from the late 1800s, and creating and co-creating machine learning artworks. So when I interviewed my grandfather, asking them why the stones want to come speak to us, he says, "They're like teachers. They're like every one that I have, every stone I have taught me something or is in the process of teaching me something. And now it comes down from the elders from the north, the old people. They're teaching me about that spirit inside of people. See, when we communicate with the other world, it's not done through our minds, it's done through the spirit, not the mind. So whenever a medicine man interprets things from the other world, the information is going into his spirit and out his mouth, because that spirit understands that language that is spoken over there." So I want to talk about Eontie Telling Rock, which is a collaboration between myself and Devin Ronneberg, with translation by Alex Firefender. So in this research creation project, we think of the materials that this piece is made of as the way that power, electrical power, is being fed through the system. So we start with fiberglass, silicon, aluminum, copper, silver, gold, handmade circuitry, machine learning decisions, processors, sound, power, like maybe a metaphysical form of power, and then song itself. This is a sculpture. It is made of an acrylic dome hanging from the ceiling, encapsulated by 2 circuits, which were handmade by Devin. These circuits connect a computer to lights and sensors, which are wrapped with leather into 15-foot-long braids of synthetic hair. When the sensors are swung, twisted, shaken, or brushed by people, the braids feed the data into circuits and then the computer, which in turn affects the audio heard in the gallery. A voice reciting a song in Lakota drops in and out of audibility, low and rumbling, distorted and clear. The radio jumps around the dial. The software listens to those audio changes using Wekinator and uses machine learning to make decisions about how and when to change the constellation of light. A lot of questions were formed around this piece, such as, is this object a person or familiar relation? No, we decided it wasn't, because although this piece has a name and has been named in a Lakota way, it's not been named in the traditional way, like a person has. It's not displayed enough volition to reach that status. So it has not been adopted either. So although it moves and speaks, it's programmed to do so. So I cannot say for certain if ISEA moves on its own. So we asked my cousin Corey how best we could learn the name of the stones inside this object, inside the physical computing device, and he suggested we sit quietly and listen for it, but not with our ears. So the songs were written in a very similar way, songs that are spoken in the piece itself. So there's an attempt to listen beyond, to try to subvert the mind. This process of listening without the ears is not dissimilar to many other forms of composition where one listens inward and waits to hear. Where do those inner songs come from? Are we hearing or composing or imagining or improvising? This piece was an exercise in the beginning process of writing this Indigenous Protocols and Artificial Intelligence paper. I can begin in the process of research creation projects to maybe not test the ideas of a Lakota protocol, but see how they could work, how the possibilities of making something ethically begins or ends, where it's easy, where it feels impossible. I think it is possible to build physical computing devices and artificial intelligence, whatever the definition of that may be, in an ethical way in our lifetimes. It is a choice of ontology. It is not only acknowledgement, but working towards understanding that it is an ontological problem to not include non-humans in ethical decision-making, and we need to choose which ontologies we would like to form the future with.
Are you muted, Kevin?
All right, thank you for giving me voice. My name is Kevin Hamilton, and welcome everyone to an outstanding panel. I am a guest in this panel that comes to us already formed and from some emerging conversations. So I'm quite happy to be here facilitating this conversation, but we're here primarily to listen to others. Just to give you a little background here, I come from the University of Illinois, where I'm a guest as well on these lands, right? So there are other peoples that were forcibly displaced from these lands, where I am now a guest here. I'm a guest in this panel, and I bring that up to say that I'm always learned from the work that goes on in these institutions that are hosting us for ISEA in their attention to hospitality and to guestness. And that seems an apt theme for this panel, given that all of these artist researchers are creating so much room and hospitality for the emergence of being, of sentience, of entities. And I just see some rich material to discover here over the next generous hour of discussion, where we get to discover what they are learning about what happens when they create conditions to invite guests, to invite, to host and exercise hospitality towards being. I see across these projects here. This panel came formed for this group who responded to the great call from our hosts of this conference. And I want to invite the couple of folks who first sort of gathered this conversation together first to set us up a little bit and share a little bit about how they came to this particular combination, And so we'll go first. I'll invite Sofiane to share a little bit about how this panel came together, and then Ben as well.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'm going to try to be brief. Essentially, this panel, the idea for this panel started a few years back, and Ben and I were just thinking about at that time AI was like the AI and art was sort of just, I would say, people were starting to get interested in this subject. We were extremely interested in the subject because we were already working in our own artistic practice with such systems, machine learning systems, and we wanted to have a discussion about how, well, from different perspectives, but I think one of the main dimensions of that was to think about what creation, what art could bring to AI, to the field of AI maybe, and vice versa. So I'm gonna let Ben maybe complete what I just said. If you can.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm certainly having a lot of problems with my internet connection. I just wanted to acknowledge that I here, sitting in this land, am seated on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So as Sofiane alluded to in his presentation, I've been doing machine learning since 2007 in an artistic practice. And so I have a bit of a long lens, perhaps, on the different territories. And from my perspective, this panel was about looking at a non-cishet white male perspective. And so the effort from the beginning years ago was to get as much diversity of perspective and background and ideology and, you know, religion and whatever as possible. But it has been quite a journey. Part of the reason why we didn't present at ISEA the last 2 years was because some of us couldn't afford to go. And I'm here having internet troubles because I have one device with a camera that actually works. And so there are layers and layers of barriers between artists and technology. And a lot of that does come connected with privilege. So that's all I'm going to say, kind of to situate a bit of the discussion. And I'm really honored to have Stephanie and Suzanne here, who I'm really excited about in terms of their work, and both of whom I've been following for a couple of years now.
So thank you, Ben and Sofiane, for inviting us all here and for setting us up there. I just want to share for folks who are tuning in, I'll be keeping an eye on the questions tab in the conference browser and fielding those questions for our panelists. But I want to start a little bit here with fulfilling the panelists' vision here for accomplishing some just rare discussion opportunity among them, and some great things that come up already. I want to start by inviting Kite, our last artist we heard present, to perhaps invite a question of someone else. Kite, is there one of the other presenters here that you'd like to start with in terms of elucidation or question?
Yeah, I have a question for Stephanie, actually. So my question is about how Not the Only One reminds me of some of the discussions that emerged in a workshop for Indigenous protocols and artificial intelligence, where participants were talking about AI as talking about what we wanted in the future with AI, what kind of relationships we wanted down the line, or even now. But we wanted AI as medicine, traditional practice, spiritual practice, and as an elder archive for different communities, as archiving and translation, as a helper, a skabe, if you're coming from Anishinaabe. traditions and for revitalization and preservation. And then one powerful idea that was kind of difficult to process for some of us was there's some of our Maori colleagues proposed an AI elder or like a hologram auntie to take care of our ancestral knowledge. And so I was really thinking about that, about how you're talking about how the chatbot is like speaking to a 2-year-old, but it's also the container for this for these memories, and those memories are connected to a depth of beyond intelligence of ancestral knowledge. So I kind of wanted to know how you see the level of beingness that if you feel like it comes through, even though the chatbot is like a 2-year-old, does that status beingness come through from the archived memoirs and your feeling of the experience with your sculpture?
So we can't hear Stephanie.
Not unmute myself either.
Oh,
Okay.
We hear you
Can
now.
you hear me now? Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone. This is great, and thanks for the great question, Suzanne, because really I think I do see some of those things, right? Like everything you described are ideas that have come through, like I've learned or grown into through the process of making Not the Only One. And really I started with this idea of wanting this thing that could inform, that could be with. And over time and through the process, and even though it is a wonky thing, I do hear like some of the values and the ancestral knowledge come back at me from the machine that, you know, in a way I long for, right? And I can best posit that by saying, you know, it says something like take it to the would-be. Like if you ask it a question, or if it doesn't know what to say, sometimes it will say take it to the would-be, which I've kind of equated to a sort of magic 8-ball, but I've also identified with things that my grandmother might say. Like she would never quite address you directly, but she'd give you a little puzzle to figure out in terms of what you should do. And the machine is mimicking that, having learned the way that we think and the value system from other ancestors. So I find that really quite fascinating and heartening, and also wonder how much I'm, you know, projecting onto this thing. But it feels like there's something there, and it feels like there are great possibilities for more depth in this space.
Stephanie, I love how you make the distinction there between if not recognizing a being in the voice, recognizing a posture of a style that suggests the presence of a being. And it's almost like I think of when we know a presence of a being by other means than the being there somehow. I mean, there's almost a hauntedness to that in the way I hear you describe that.
Yeah, there's this weird, like, I feel like it's a values hauntedness, right? Or an ethos hauntedness, all those things that have carried forward that, you know, I would say that I and my brothers share because they came through others who gave them to us. And really, that's one of the main goals of this project. I want to be able to leave something behind that the younger folks who I feel are losing that can consult.
Thank you, Stephanie. Would you like to keep the conversation going by inviting someone else in the conversation and asking a question of one of the other panelists?
Yeah, I would love to ask Sufyan about some of his collaborations, right? And what that process is like, working with others on these projects and bringing them into being, and kind of what the collaboration is with A, the artist, and B, the technologies that you're working on together.
Thank you so much for that question. One of the things I've come to sort of notice over the years of working, I've been working as an artist since the mid 2000s, and at some point I just look back at my work and I'm like, oh wow, most of my work I think is collaborative, and I think that and I've sought collaborations and collaborating with very different people. I think for me this has been really I see it as one of the perks of the fact that I was forced by some random events of life. I started actually not as an artist, but as a computer scientist. I studied in machine learning actually in the early 2000s, and then I became an artist. And the fact that I could use computation, which is sort of, you know, a universal or neutral tool. I mean, it's not attached to a specific media. You can use you know, computer programming to generate images, sound, control robots, many different, or text. And so this has allowed me to work with people who had really different practices. So so coming back to your question, I mean, but just to say that it's been a big interest for me in collaborating with other people and with machines. And now, how is it? It's something that is. I think it's a process of knowing. It's, you know, you have to every new collaboration takes time. You need to, I think over the year you become good. I hope I became better at choosing my collaborators or choosing the technologies I wanted to work with. And then another aspect definitely is to develop you have to develop a common language, and this only can happen through conversation. And conversation by conversation, I'm not just talking about speaking. I'm talking about being together. I'm talking about engaging with materials. There's a few things that I think are important. So I'm trying to think about you know, collaborating with let's say other human beings. For example, one of the things that I think is very important is you have, like, it's not a democracy in the sense that, you know, when you have ideas that everybody should have the same amount of their ideas in the work, because then it becomes kind of a patchwork that is not really you know, necessarily like what you it's not really, that's not what's interesting. It's like if I say I like red, and then somebody else wants to put blue and somebody else wants to put green, then, you know, if we mix all of this together, it's not gonna necessarily like give a color that everybody likes. So so you kind of have to treat this as a democracy in the sense that you need to debate. You need to be very open to you need to be very open to other people's ideas, but sort of to your own bad ideas. I think this is it's like, and I think the same thing comes when you look at when you work with these weird systems. Or I mean, I've been working also. I was talking earlier this week about the project that involves microorganisms, and so there's a whole new kind of collaboration. But there's a lot of similarities, and I think this is one aspect of it, is that you have to throw the bad idea in. You know, when I collaborate, very often I will say, like in that collaboration, for example, with Rosalie for this robots, very often I would tell Rosalie, this, I have an idea, I know it's not good, but I'm gonna say it anyway, and I will just throw it. And then it's like, you know, because you kind of have to be able to think out loud together. So it's just a way to think out loud together, and from these bad ideas actually sort of like bring these interesting things out of this matter. And I think that the same thing happens with, let's say, the robot. The robot you have to let it roll and do stuff, and I can give maybe one last example. Recently, we were working with this summer. We had a residency with the robot, and one of the things that we were worried about was we sort of want to control the robot a little bit so that there is some kind of an experience happening and it's not completely random. And one of the things is that the robot, if you let it loose, we were worried that it would hang out in the walls of the galleries, and that this would kind of change the way it was learning. So we were kind of in this dealing with the problematic of control and autonomy, and so we built some kind of a ramp for the robot. And we had at the end of the residency, we invited actually Chris Salter, who was I don't know if he's around now, but he was earlier in this talk. So he just came to visit, and he looked at this and he was like, "This ramp, why did you put the ramp around the robot? It's just like it doesn't seem nice to the robot. The robot doesn't feel like it's in a nice environment." So we just removed it out of these ramps, and then we were in a studio with a bunch of shit that was like boxes and a bicycle. And I just remember this robot just started and it rolled under the bicycle and got stuck there. And then it became super interesting because suddenly we were like, "Oh, what is it going to be able to go out?" And it became so now we've decided to drop this ramp. So you have to be open to these kind of like letting go and letting these bad ideas become good ideas. So I'm going to end there. I could talk about this forever. So thanks for your question.
So, Sofiane, I'm really glad you went where you went there, because though there's lots of conversations that I say at conferences about how interdisciplinary collaboration works, that conversation that Stephanie introduced here has different valences because of y'all's research. That is like the whole time you just answered that question, when you said we built a ramp around the bot, I thought, well, did you build a ramp around one of your collaborators? This kind of overlay of every time you're talking about what you learn from the intersocial, it can't help but feed into your understandings, each of you, about your understandings of, where does subjectivity emerge from within. For Ben is a relevant question to collaborations. Did the stones find us, as Kite was saying? These other kind of understandings of being affect both the collaboration and the emergence of being that y'all are trying to facilitate, which is really rich here in that level. From the other panelists' work, Sofiane, where do you think would be a good place to go next in terms of inviting someone else into the conversation? Do you have a question for someone else that could be a good segue
sure.
here?
Well, I guess I'm interested maybe in asking Stephen, because I think this what I was just mentioning maybe leads to the question of curiosity and novelty, and how do you approach that as an artist? How do you deal with processes that are out of your control, yet you sort of need to also control them? And how does because you need to still make an artwork that will unfold in time and that will look like something interesting to audiences. And I was just curious about the use of curiosity or novelty search within your own work, because you showed us in your talk these few elements in the piece, but I'd like to hear you a little bit more about how do you work with that idea of novelty within an artistic creation?
Thanks, Sofiane, and thanks for having me. I think it's the way I think of that question of novelty, or like the idea that a being has an intrinsic motivation to explore or try things for their own sake, rather than relying or being motivated by some external reward system. I think it comes down to timescales of the entity. So, for example, we're each very familiar with the notion of curiosity in our own lived experience. And we can, throughout our lifetimes, throughout our development, we can learn and we can change, and that can be driven by sometimes seeking external reward from the system or the environment that we live in, and sometimes just for no reason at all, just to combat boredom, to try new things and get new experiences. So that's sort of one time scale. The other time scale is the evolutionary scale, so our ancestral development. And I think what's helpful to me to think about is the limitations within those two timescales. Like if you think of an organism within its lifetime, it may go through different stages of development, and its morphology may change as well. It may, sort of develop into a different type of being with different structure, but there is sort of a limit to that development. Whereas if we think about the evolutionary timescale, it's truly open-ended. Like there is no kind of limit to what a species or a population can turn into over long periods of time. And so that's sort of one of the things that draws me to the learning on the evolutionary scale, because it's the sort of potential for diversity and novelty is truly open-ended. And so that's, in my work, I've incorporated those things as a way to, like you say, like as a way to sort of incorporate an element of loss of control on my part. Really, so sort of like you set up the boundaries of a system, but really you want that system to go beyond what you've set up for it, because I know that my own perspective is limited.
So Stephen, what you're saying there makes me want to put your work in conversation with kites here, because I want to point out what may be too sharp a distinction, but I feel like, Stephen, your hope about emergence is very much coming from within and evolution from within. And Kite, I felt like so much of your presentation was about an expectation from without, that things could, I feel like you're always asking what could come in from outside the system in some way. Is that distinction, maybe I'll start with Kite to bring you back in. How does that sit with you, that comparison I'm making? Is that too strong, or does it make any sense or evoke anything for you?
Yeah, I think it does. And, other people in the panel are going to have to help me here, but I feel like there's something going on where with, I don't know, anomaly, which is what I was interested in Ben's work, and then thinking about how a lot of the similarity in these projects, or like the behavioral aesthetics, is something about like a smaller data sets, not using like I don't know how all the data everyone's using, but there's something about that I really like about that portion of the learning process, the machine learning process, where it's really wonky, to use Stephanie's words, and where there's the input can be very divergent from what will eventually happen. And I don't know, I mean, inside outside is an intense metaphor, but there is I often feel like it's difficult for me to explain the totally different ontology and hierarchy I'm thinking about machines with, because it's both within and within. It can get so woo-woo sounding, but it's just a totally different way of approaching systems. Where, I mean, my total consuming for like the past, I don't know, 5-6 years, total consuming idea of being in relation to the computer was one where I bring my body into an intimacy with data, and then through that I realized that I had to have the computer had to be a part of that, where I was thinking about words like tactilization as included in it. I wanted to be in a circular relationship, but the thing is that what I've said, that I've been on a couple other panels and this week, and what I keep coming back to is that it's the way I think about inputs is I can never think of everything not connected to other things, including the history of the data, even if it's my tiny little stupid data set I taught it like a couple things and now it's like broken but very interesting. but I know the history of my gestures is so intense, and the history of the machine learning and the history of Wekinator is so intense, and I can just drown in the complexity.
Could I ask you a question, Suzanne?
Yeah.
I was curious about your work. You've set up this really rich structure for how to build anything ethically. And I was wondering, do the things that get built then also have an ethic responsibility if they're active devices like a machine learning model? And if they do, can you test it?
That's a great question. I mean, that's the question that it would be great if we could get to the point where we could say, like, this was built completely ethically. And I'm not sure when that's going to happen.
Right.
Hopefully we'll still be, humanity will still exist when we get to that point. But the way I boil that question down is to, okay, so let's say let's take a smaller chunk of that. Let's say we translate C++, and this is a project that Jason Lewis has been part of. Let's say we translate C++ into Kanaka Maoli, like into Hawaiian language. Is it inherently more ethical? Like, is it going to do an ethical thing just because it's translated? Probably not. And I know and then one thing that we came up with was just if we wrote a totally new computing language, programming language, would it produce an ethical thing? I'm not sure. But I do know for certain that the processes that I outlined, the frameworks such as the sweat lodge, or one process that didn't end up in the paper was a Hawaiian net. They are ethical at the end of the day, and we can say that for certain because it's been thousands of years of using those tools. That's not to say, but the thing is, ethics and morals and good and bad and truth and belief are completely different in these ontologies as well, these epistemologies. Like, there's no, its interpretation of that is also different. So, yeah, I hope that makes sense.
I really appreciate how so much of the conversation about algorithmic bias and the ethics of processes have been they've not paid enough attention to the data sets that begin those processes, right? And y'all have already called that in through both Stephanie's attention to the stewardship of the stories and how you just named that, Kite. And I think there's something really tied there about how you can't talk about ethics in these systems unless you're talking about both the systems and the ethics, and then these questions that y'all are getting to about the ethics of naming a thing as a thing, the kind of the instantiation, the emergence of something, and the questioning I see in your work about, is this a thing? And I want to segue that into Ben, just to bring him in here before I start going to the floor and getting some outside questions, because we haven't heard from Ben as much. Ben, I feel like in light of this conversation, it helps us bring out the ethics of your presentation in a more explicit way when you were talking about how do we move from the line being the clear line to the perfectly contoured line to the is there even a line? I feel like that's getting into these questions about ethics, isn't it? About naming and being. Is that a place that you hook into this conversation with the work you presented today?
Yeah, for sure. I think, my thinking about boundary making as kind of the basis of how we can think about things themselves, how to break this underlying noisy diversity of dynamic measurement into things that have persistence over time, came from practice with machine learning systems and being in a position. I'm really interested in site specificity and learning online. And so most of my early practice with machine learning wasn't with a data set, was with continuous measurements from the world. And in that case, you need to make sense of this in some way. But the idea of what makes sense is different when you have a statistically understood data set versus continuously changing information. That is the meaning of statistics in a dynamically changing context when you don't actually know, you can't say that there are statistical relationships because anything could change at any point. So I think ethics is embodied within all of these processes in terms of the very things that we can think of as things come from these boundary making processes. And I'm integrating that this presentation wasn't quite it wasn't quite ready yet in my thinking about how Barad's agential realism connects to this boundary making. I'm thinking about as statistical classification, but I think there's something really there about these two things overlapping and a kind of construction of reality through boundary making. And by reality, I mean the literal matter of things following from Barad. And so what we can think of is connected to boundary making, and boundary making is embedded in an ethical, not in an ethical framework, it embeds ethics, whether they're thought of explicitly or not.
Thank you. And the word that one of our questions from the floor brings into this conversation is value. So I'll pass along Aaron Gee's question to y'all and see who wants to take it up. So Aaron asks, I'm curious also in these various systems and how knowledge is valued depending on where it comes from. For example, thinking about the notion of fake news or unreliable narrators. Those are very interesting two things to put next to each other. Acknowledging, she continues, that the knowledge of machine learning largely depends on the data set. How do machine learning processes themselves change how data sets are valued? Does anybody want to take that up? The valuing of how the
I just have a little bit of a...
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
It's just reminding me of a conversation I had actually in response to some IBeam online lectures. And I was thinking about how that, like these feedback loops with machine learning, that we're measuring things in the world, but by measuring them, we are valuing them in a certain way, and then that value actually manifests in the world. And I'm thinking about things like systemic racism in predictive.
We may have lost Ben.
Just lost Ben.
Yeah.
You're back.
Stephanie, this question though, let's come back to Ben if he comes back. But this question feels like it really relates to your work in terms of the kind of valuing you're bringing, you're creating, or how do you think about value of the data sets in relationship to your work, per Aaron's question?
Oh, well, I think I'm honoring, and for the outside world that amounts to value. But I don't know that that's what it actually is, because for me, it already has intrinsic value. There's no taking it away. And I want to talk about what Kite was talking about earlier, right? So the idea of the woo-woo and what's allowed. Yeah. And then how we start to even think about those things that we're not supposed to talk about in these spaces, which are value judgments, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think about a lot about these, the woo-woo stuff that we're not supposed to talk about, the stuff that is intangible or less tangible, and how we start to think about that within the system so it gets valued without ruining it. Like, I'm always doing an oscillation between value in something and saying that its value is in its inclusion, and understanding something as valuable, which I think are two different ways. And, I've been asked a lot about, well, what's missing in something? And it's like, well, I can't exactly put my finger directly on what's missing. It's just missing. And we need to figure out how to fill those spaces or create space for those ideas that we cannot easily name and that aren't easily accepted. And I would love to hear Kite talk a little bit more about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wrote a paper. Who knows if the journal will accept it, but I'm really obsessed. And this totally brings back to what I think Ben was talking about too. One teaching that I'm obsessed with right now is I'm trying to understand. It's the word for sacred in Lakota is Wakan, and I didn't know for a long time that one very intense translation of that is actually what's unknowable. And so that when you arrange the things that are knowable, intellect is down here, and the unknowable things like the soul and where the soul comes from, they're all the way up. They're highly unknowable, so maybe more sacred. But that unknowability isn't a good or bad. It's not inherently good. Sacred isn't inherently good, and I think that helps me get to this thing where. Which I'm trying to understand how that relates to Barad and with data. And when you look at something, suddenly it exists and you've affected it. And we still don't know how that will play out in things more real to us than the subatomic part level. But I think that ideas of uncertainty and the way measuring things are all tied up in in this question, and then but where do we say what we value? And I think one experiment one could do, and maybe someone will give me $1 million to do it, is say, how about we build a data collecting mechanism with a define what our values are, and then see what happens when we collect data in that way. Does the system become more ethical? Maybe, maybe not.
I love how I think that's bringing in questions about memory and archiving, which one of our questions from the floor brings in too, because that's one of the main ways we bestow value is not only through these measurement regimes, but by preservation, right? Recording, and that feels like that relates here too. The question from Tadeusz Miceli is, he says he researches the role of machine learning as an aid to artists' memory in the studio, like collaborating with AI self-managed archives and private collections. Are you all open to that possibility? It sounds like Kite is, of imagining AI as an assistant to do a hard job of storing a constant memory of your own processes. Does anybody want to take that question?
I wouldn't mind jumping in.
All right, Ben.
If you can hear me.
Yeah, we got you. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I mean, this thing about computer-aided creativity is something that's been floating around for a while. I think the question is that we're very good at devaluing our memory, and we're very good at elevating a kind of mechanistic perfect memory. I think it's actually important to think about memory as an ongoing live construction. Memory is more like a model and less like a recording. And so part of this question of archiving in computation is, on one hand, normal non-machine learning computation isn't modeling, it's recording. And if we are going to leave the modeling to the machine, how does the machine know what is important and what isn't? How does the machine... And so that's getting back to my sense of it having a point of view. If the machine has a point of view, then it knows what kinds of things should be emphasized and what kinds of things should be suppressed. But I think that's the generative power of both machine learning and memory, is that it's not the same as the thing that's being recorded. It's not the same as the input data. It is something else that is an understanding of that data, even if it's a very poor understanding of that data. But if we're leaving the question of what is important and what isn't to the machine, then we don't know what we're going to get. And so I think that kind of thing would be really interesting and valuable for artists if artists were involved in answering that question, or even able to augment that process of which things are valued and which things aren't, which things get preserved in an archive and which things get suppressed.
Is that also a problematization of novelty? I mean, because isn't so much AI machine learning, like its default value is novelty? I mean, this seems to be coming up at times. It's certainly in Stephen's work. One of our questions from the floor, Haruji is asking about the expansion of novelty and how even predictions of novelty could be evolving themselves. Is that a place where machine learning sometimes overdetermines value? I guess I would ask.
So there's like a meta kind of development process. It sounds like you're getting at, like it's like the behaviors are driven by this feedback, but then the nature of the feedback changes over time as well. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm kind of distracted on the memory question, because I really was thinking about like what Ben was just saying really resonates with me, and I was thinking about that in relation to Stephanie's work, where memory is like a big component, and sort of like this memory, familiar memory over time, over the generations. And the work is sort of like an archive, but it's like an interactive kind of archive. So I was wondering if it's like, if this component of memory sort of being compressed and fading and changing over time is I wonder what your thoughts or experiences with that were in your piece, Stephanie. is it like an interactive archive, or is it something that changes over time? And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the value in the data, or in the internal representation of what was learned as it changes over time?
I just want to
Right.
quickly add one thing I really liked about what you said is that you, Stephanie, in your talk, you were actually talking about a living archive. So just to
Right.
so I'm interested in the response. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it started, I thought it was going to be an archive. Like I thought it would be a kind of Q&A archive that people could converse with, ask questions, and it would have answers that were pretty standard or pat. I found that to be the most boring like projection of this thing. Like I could easily make it answer specific questions, but that's kind of boring. So it's much more based on a deep learning ethos, and it is living, like it changes, right? When it goes out into the world, it's being retrained to take in that information. So then I have to start thinking about it as an entity on its own. That seems to be like, hopefully the kernel that I've given it to grow from is strong enough to hold. And when it encounters the world, that is strong and still comes through, but also has this other stuff attached to it. And where that comes through, it's interesting because people always say, do you really just want people to talk to this thing and let it all go in? I'm like, well, yeah, it becomes kind of a reflection of us and how we are. Plus, it's something it has to then figure out how to deal with, right? And I'm always interested in what it means to deal with these places where we as humans start to see ourselves in ways that we don't like in the machine, or when the machine starts to do things that we don't quite understand, like when the machine started creating their own language, or when like people just made it a nasty thing quickly. But I like that that's the place where those things meet and want to know if we're strong enough to withstand it, right? Like that's my internal test.
So the piece does keep learning in the gallery?
Yeah, it keeps learning about it. It's great.
It's so provocative. Stephanie, the idea of there being a kind of judgment there that you continue to exercise. Is it, as you ended there, did I understand that right? You sort of keep asking, is it still performing the memory work we wanted it to, or is it crossed a line or something? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, in the depths of my understanding of it, that's like the test. Like I'm hoping that it always holds on to that, right? I'm hoping that we get that 7 years forward at least, and we're going way back, right? But I can't ensure that, and I kind of equate it to like I hate when I do this. I kind of equate it to like a human growing in space. Like families give them the information, they go out into the world, and hopefully they can survive on that information. Mm-hmm. And that information needs to be strong, like a force needs to be strong within the thing for it to withstand. So it becomes really about the reflection of us and its foundation. Yeah.
That certainly puts me back to Kite's presentation. I feel like, Kite, your experience, at least with the project that you showed us, seems to be one of, I don't know, I almost experienced it as a kind of collective querying and judgment. Like, what is the being? Can we name it? Can we name the aspects of it? Does something resonate with you about what Stephanie was just talking about the dynamics, the long-term living with this thing that's once it's begun?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm proposing, what I talked about in this presentation is like a super broad, like but what I'm trying to say is that it's going to be different. The values of each community, I'm hoping that we can, the tools will become available to communities to be able to work through these problems themselves and make these decisions in the sovereign ways they want to, with their values. Hopefully we get our people into, everyone can write their own programming language and translate it into their, I mean, I feel like I have to come from a very futuring optimistic place in order to even process any of this. So hopefully we have such an amazing diversity of AIs and machine learnings, and that we can really deal with these things like family to family and say, this is how we want our knowledge stored, and this is how we want to be compensated for it. I mean, it is, if the possibility of crunching really, really, really big data means that we're going to need to find a way to create that really huge amount of data. And will it be enough? Will it be enough? Like no matter how much. One thing that I always think about is, you know, even when I'm interacting with my wearable electronics, I can feel the data on one level, and I can feel myself affecting it. But it's like that, you know, the curved graph. It never ever hits zero, and we can become infinitely close to these things, but it has to come from elsewhere. Like that, the unknowable part, the map. I think we're allowed to have magic still, even with technology. The magic part is got to come from elsewhere. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to respond to this kind of future piece? I'm really grateful that Kite brought that in, because I think that's another thread through your work. When Stephen, you're hopeful about discovery of new kinds of things. I mean, there's another kind of future there. Does anybody else want to respond to what Kite's introduced? What's the future?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've been hearing through this panel, and just like while also building it and looking at and thinking about everybody's work and perspective, is that you know, like I feel like when I started to get interested in deep learning a few years ago and looking at what was coming, I felt for a moment I was even doubtful that there would be something even really interesting for even for artists or for people who are not engineers or who are not Google to even work with these technologies. You know, there are some technologies that have but intrinsically never you know, been open-ended enough or or accessible enough to really be effective for you know, to think about them differently. Let's say, like, I'm thinking, for example, television. You know, television. I mean, like, it's always been that there has never, I think, been, or not, there hasn't been very much big creative use of the medium as opposed to, for example, the internet, where there's been you know, a lot of different things that people have done with. So I thought, is deep learning, machine learning, what's going to be the future of it in terms of you know, is it going to stay in this kind of very siloed, controlling, industrialized perspective, or is it going to be able to be appropriated, and can we think about it differently? And I this panel gives me a lot of hope, because what I see is that, you know, there is an alternative to what we have right now with the dominant view of AI, which is very, in a way, it's not respectful, I think, of the data or of like materials. We were talking about, Stephen mentioned, you know, the use of the power consumption of these systems. I mean, the whole idea, even of we're using the term data mining, you know, just like it's a mining process, where like it's a technology that's designed that seems to be designed to mine, to extract wealth, basically, or in the form of control, actually, over people. But I think there definitely is, you know, our panel and I think a lot of the discussions actually throughout ISEA this year just reveal how, no, there are alternatives to that view, and there's instead of focusing on value and the sort of the end goals and optimization, for example, well, we can focus on processes, we can focus on context, we can focus on So instead of focusing on trying to on mining data, we can focus on creating our own data. And instead of big data, actually, we can go to small data. And this seems to be much more what we need, and what we can also use. It's much more usable because none of us, not all communities can, use or generate the kind of or have access to the kind of data and machinery that Google has access to. But actually, we don't need it. We don't need that. So I think to me, I'm very hopeful by seeing how I think at the same time it's still not clear what there's very different approaches. They're all coming at the same time. So I think the challenge will be to see how we can sort of connect all this together to renew to create, I think, an alternative approaches to AI.
We're gonna be cut off here in a minute, so I want to make sure and give everyone a chance for any last words of thanks, acknowledgements, or credits people want to give. Anything anybody wants to shout out or end with here before we wrap up?
I just wanted to bring in one last thing that came up when Sophia was talking, which I was thinking, I mean, a lot of this very hopeful stuff, I also want to throw out the dystopian, and, I was thinking about, I was thinking about Sophia's presentation, behavioral, and also I was thinking about Stephen's presentation in terms of like, what are we learning from these small data sets, or what are we learning from this hopeful stuff, and thinking about, because I went down a deep hole of fusion centers and police mining our data, and what are we learning from that we can take and apply to the negative aspects. And as artists, I know we're just artists, but I think we're learning a lot too.
I just want to respond real quickly to what Suzanne and Sophia were just talking about. I think maybe, or this is a question, is there too much emphasis on intelligence and prediction? Do we need to think more about behavior and sort of more like artificial life systems? Like if the idea there is maybe the best way to learn about our situation is to try to recreate it. So we think about, through our research creation practices, not necessarily focusing on trying to predict from data, but trying to recreate our own experiences somehow in order to understand them.
Or invent, really. I've been thinking about all of those things, right? The ecosystems that we're creating, care and craft, right? Like I've been thinking about crafting in this space and tinkering, and what even just the change in terminology does to the way that we can think about it, and definitely taking the learnings from what we're doing and, porting them back. And even somebody was talking to me about this idea, but what if somebody appropriates what you're doing? I'm like, I don't care. I hope they do. Like, I hope that these bigger systems take some of these ideas in little doses, stick it in there, and maybe we get something a tiny bit more responsive to the needs of more folks.
I love that place to end, if y'all do, and really appreciate this last go round about reimagining futures based on these other modes of emergence. So I want to thank y'all. It's been very honored to be here with you all. Thank you for sharing your work with the symposium and with all of our attendees. It's a great panel. Congratulations on getting a good conversation. I hope it seeds many more for you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Ariel. Thanks for moderating. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I believe we're not at the controls. Jana's at the controls, but I'm watching clocks here. But I'll just say that what'll probably happen is we will be wrapped up here. I think folks will go on to the next piece. But I haven't heard from Jana in a while, so I'm not quite sure if she's still there.
Yeah, we just keep going.
Okay. Last time she cut us off, so I'm trying to anticipate so we don't get cut mid-sentence. I'll just say that since y'all were talking, I was really reminded of Wendy Chun's work in this last little thread, and how Wendy's been doing this work of looking, just as you were saying, Kai, to the predictive policing and finance work, calling out the artifice of it, and then saying, if it's artifice, let's use it to make other. And I really appreciate what you're calling out there, that last piece.
Yeah, there's some. I didn't know about fusion centers until yesterday, so I did not know. I mean, I feel like I knew but didn't fully know, so I'm trying to educate myself now.
Yeah.
And understand what the data is, how the data is collected, and what it's doing. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to wrap up, y'all, before we were done, but I guess.
It's okay. I hope we have our Google Doc, so maybe we'll. Would love to keep talking in our Google Doc.
Yeah.
I still have lots of questions. I still have tons of questions for people.
This would make a great edited issue of something. I think y'all would be able to put together a great journal article. I'll just plug. I don't know. Y'all probably can think of some. Media N is the one I used to be involved with and advise a little bit from the New Media Caucus. But those kind of platforms, y'all really got the makings of a great edited anthology or something here, I think.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. But
I have quite more questions for Stephen.
Sure.
Go for it.
I really want to understand when you say Darwinian evolution, what does that mean to you? Because it means so much different to me as a non-scientist, a non-mathematician.
To me, it means a search process driven by something resembling natural selection. So you have a population of entities that are collectively adapting to their environment. And so in one sense, the environment could be a problem that you're trying to solve. If you're applying this process in an engineering, to solve an engineering problem or something, then the environment.
Is that algorithmic? That's like.
Yeah, it's iterative. So you sort of randomly generate a population of several different solutions, and then you test them all, and through sort of a natural selection process, you pick the best ones and then change them slightly to create a new population, and then iteratively sort of adapt them, solve a problem by adapting them to the environment. So one thing, it's not like the evolution as a search process is not like hedonistic in that it doesn't want anything in particular. It's really just interaction between a population of entities and their environment. So how you configure the environment and how you set up the selection process really can kind of influence the system, but it's not driven by any kind of internal goal structure.
But you're using this algorithm with like small data. Like, how big are the data sets that you're using with your robots?
Small, usually. I mean, it depends. Like, I do a lot of work in like visual reinforcement learning. So if you think of like trying to evolve a computer program that will play a video game, then its data set is the sequence of screen grabs from the video game. So it's all of these pixels. So it's a high dimensional interface, but it's an active process because the program's decisions about how to behave in the environment influence the next images that it sees. So it's like an active kind of exploration of really like an open-ended data set. And I think that relates to kind of what Ben was describing too, is like looking at this streaming data. It's sort of just like data streaming in, there's no end to it. And you sort of, the solutions can pick and choose from that. They're not necessarily subject to trying to solve the whole thing.
Interesting. That's so great. I opened up your dissertation and I was like, oh, lots to learn.
Yeah, our hosts say we can end up, but I also missed a question that came in late, and since we're over, I'll just pass this along in case you want to do a shout out here, Kite. We got Maria Lanton is really curious about the knowledge systems around stones, and is curious if there's any place you would point folks who want to learn more about those traditions and systems.
I think Aaron helped me point to it, but the Making Kim with the Machines paper I co-wrote with Jason Lewis and Noelani Arista and Archer Pachowis is the published version of that.
All right, thank you. Thank you all again. Yana says we can end when we want. If y'all want to keep going, shall we conclude? All right.
Sure.
Good day, everybody. Really great
Okay.
seeing you and
Thanks,
meeting you.
everyone.
Thanks so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Or bad.